So we're discussing a great planetary program from China, and this is part of what Xi Jinping has announced as the China Dream. Of course, part of that China Dream is to make China and the Chinese people wealthy by 2050, 2030. I forget the exact. Of course, it brings me to the question about the Philippine and the Filipino dream. We'll have to discuss that. But simultaneous, or maybe even earlier than the China Dream. I know this because I had attended conferences in Leesburg, Virginia as far back as 1997, and I have been reading since 1994, 95. And Butch Valdes has been promoting, preaching, advocating this vision of the LaRouche movement for a global land bridge and the Great Water Project. What do they call it? The water project?
Eurasian Land Bridge.
The Eurasian Land Bridge.
Yeah.
What about the water?
The NAWAPA. NAWAPA project.
What does that mean, NAWAPA?
Well, the NAWAPA project was started during President Kennedy's time, which meant
National Water, something?
National Water and Power Administration, whatever.
I'm sorry, I
like
surprised you with that question, but
yeah, but this was started in President Kennedy's time. The design was supposed to, you see the mountains of Canada covered by snow. Somehow, when they melt during a certain period of time, they pass through the United States in this way, and then exit very quickly into the ocean. Now, what the NAWAPA project was supposed to is to harness this water. It's a water resource, you know, and to direct that water flow instead of going into the sea right away. Use it by constructing major canals and rivers to bring it down all the way through the California area and all the way into the middle part of the United States as a part of not just irrigation, but principally, precisely to boost up food production for the rest of the United States.
That I wanted to bring that up because we've been talking about trains, roads, and so on. But water is projected to be one of the most serious needs of mankind in the coming decades. And if Kennedy and the LaRouche movement have such water projects, again, a grand infrastructure vision, China also has the moving southern waters to the north program. But I also would like to say that the late Muammar Gaddafi had this great water project also in Libya that would try to green the deserts of Libya and North Africa. Why is this important? Aside from the physical infrastructure on land, water, again, is infrastructure.
Yes.
And that is something we Filipinos lack in terms of awareness, consciousness, no?
Oh, yeah. Which is sad. I have to say that there was no lack of understanding of this. I'm sorry to say that because there's no politics here. During the Marcos regime,
yes, I can see.
There was a major effort to try to go into hydroelectric,
and irrigation,
and irrigate, because part of that will have to be irrigation, which means putting up dams and a series of dams in the major rivers of the Philippines, and generating electricity from them. And once you have a dam, you also have an artificial lake. That artificial lake becomes now a source of irrigation, wherein you can start constructing tributaries, canals, for water to reach those areas that are normally not arable. And the moment water reaches land, that means it becomes productive for food.
So, Butch, what I'm stressing is, we're describing these things, what I'm stressing is for the Filipino public to understand the great civilizations, how it happens, and how it is connected to their great vision of infrastructure. That is why people like Anders Corr, C-O-R-R, and those who promoted this idea that these infrastructure projects will just keep us in bondage and slave us, are deliberately trying to prevent our development as a part of the human race. Why do you think there are people doing that? Well, I know the LaRouche movement has a concept of this. No? Of course, you call it the American system versus the British monarchy.
Yes, yes.
But what is the essential message there?
Well, their essential message is no development, no improvement of the quality of life of populations, and easier to control. Because the British, the reason we say British, but actually British in conjunction with what we call financial oligarchy, their concept is imperialism. The true imperialism is not by putting armies in these countries. The true imperialism is when you were able to control that country's money. When you control that country's money or currency, then you control their resources, then you control their politics, then you control their population.
And the way to do it is to keep it from developing infrastructure that will free it and make it more productive and self-sufficient.
Yes, yeah. And it is counter to human nature. Human nature, and we're the only species in the world that thinks in this way. We always think of improving the quality of life of the human beings. Always we have this vision of the next generation being in a better quality of life, and so on and so forth. Always we look towards that. You can't do that unless you build. That's why the building of infrastructure is natural, innate in a human being. To build it so that the quality of life of the next generation gets better and better. You can check it out in the internet. President Kennedy, when he was inaugurating a number of dams that they were constructing, he was saying, this was in 1962, I remember hearing a speech of his, referring to this infrastructure, these dams that they were inaugurating, saying that I would like to hear the, something like the reaction of generations from now, somewhere in the year 2000 or so, and how they look at us, that we have built these things so that they would live a better quality of life. It is so heartening to hear somebody like that thinking generations before, and actually projecting what they're building now to benefit the next few.
When you come to think of it, the Marcos period was also a golden age of infrastructure. The San Juanico Bridge, the Pan-Philippine Highway, hydroelectric dams, and so on.
Not just hydroelectric. He went into geothermal and actually went into nuclear.
That's right. That's right.
And that was to prepare for the next generations.
That's right.
But of course, the interests, the financial interests, principally, not the leftists or whatever. They had something to do.
So I'm not surprised that Duterte trying to introduce a new golden age of infrastructure is also being obstructed in this.
Yes. Not just Duterte, but the whole program of that is being initiated by China, participated in by 130 different countries right now. The same problem of Duterte is being faced by President Trump, because he's thinking not in the same line as the Wall Street people, but he's thinking for the future.
He's also thinking of infrastructure. President Trump.
Yeah.
Now, that was what you were trying to explain when you were at the Kamaning Bakery Cafe Media Forum.
Yeah.
Let's review what you said there. Can you roll it?
There was a conference, a summit, that was held in Beijing. Attended and represented 130 countries represented in that conference, and 30 leaders of their nations also went there to participate. The whole summit was focused on inaugurating and letting the whole world know that there was such a thing as a One Belt, One Road project. One Belt, One Road is the ambitious global infrastructure project that aims to create an economic corridor that will form a belt around the world, connecting all 7 continents of the world. This is the new and modern version of the Silk Road, which connected Asia to Europe. And it has to be infrastructure, meaning making use not just of trains, but all other modern facilities. And countries that were going to be involved wherein this economic corridor was going to pass will necessarily have to prop up their own countries in terms of infrastructure. Nuclear energy, mass transit systems, and so on and so forth, which will, if this corridor traverses their country, obviously they were anticipating a greater productivity and greater commerce. Just imagine, even now, it doesn't take too much to understand that if you build a highway from one portion to the other, no, let's say, you will, wherever that highway traverses, you start creating opportunities for businesses along that highway. The same concept, only in grander scale. This was initiated, of course, by President Xi Jinping of China and fully supported by Russia and participated, like I said, by now, the first 130 countries and a lot more countries intending to participate in this. This project is the first of its kind to be initiated by humanity. I say by humanity. No project of this grand scale ever was initiated by man. And then man, 130 countries are saying, we want development instead of war. This was the alternative presented, a new paradigm of economic development presented by all of these countries, not just President Xi Jinping. This is a collaboration initially of 130 countries saying, we want development instead of war.
So, Butch, you have been involved with the LaRouche movement since 1975?
Well,
Sometime then?
1984, 85.
1984, 85.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. That was my first introduction to the LaRouche organization because I accidentally looked into a magazine called Executive Intelligence Review. And in that magazine, the featured article in the cover, it was a featured article in the cover, says the Philippines, Kissinger's next Iran. Okay. That was the title. That's why it attracted me. Remember, in 1985, our political situation was very bad. No? And everything was directed towards Marcos' dictatorship, and he was actually demonized during this period. All international and local agencies were pointing to him as the culprit. And all of a sudden, you see something like the Philippines, Kissinger's next Iran. And Iran had just suffered a setback when the Shah of Iran was toppled in 1979 and went into, well, Khomeini and so on and so forth. I said, this was going to happen to the Philippines. So I started reading the article. And in the article, it mentioned that Marcos was slated for an overthrow.
Regime change now. Now it's called regime change.
Yeah, because he had infrastructure projects. He had an 11-point industrialization project, and he had an energy development program which included nuclear energy, which was geared towards industrializing the Philippines. And the financial oligarchy at the time, the money lenders of the world, they were not mentioning countries' heads. They focused on the financial oligarchy, saying they won't let him. And it all depends as to how he's going to face up with the situation. And eventually, of course, I read that article in 1984. And so by 1986, he was taken out. Ever since then, I communicated with the LaRouche organization, and soon after got very much involved in many of their discussions and conferences, and I attended them and met Mr. LaRouche himself and Helga LaRouche and the other members of the organization. And then by 1990s, there was a book that they promoted, basically the ideas of Mr. LaRouche and Ms. Helga LaRouche, which was called the Eurasian Land Bridge Project. The Eurasian Land Bridge Project meant connecting the whole of Asia with the whole of Europe, and possibly including the United States, the Americas, using the Bering Straits as
either a bridge over across it or a tunnel.
A tunnel, but basically a tunnel, which was apparently a project which was conceived more than 60, 70 years ago.
And in fact, I read Chinese literature proposing that project even today.
Even today. So now, and they were saying that it needed participation of the whole world, most especially they identified 4 countries: China, Russia, United States, and India. And if these 4 countries got into it, there will be no geopolitical threats, which means there will be no wars. And because the whole world will be focused on a developmental program for mankind. Now, Ms. Helga LaRouche, from that time on, because Mr. LaRouche was principally staying in the United States and Germany, was going around, and the most often visited place of Ms. Helga LaRouche was China. Practically the whole of 1990s and the middle of 2000. So when she was doing that, she was lecturing in different universities, and possibly these universities that you were speaking of earlier. And so much so that she gained a moniker, she gained a nickname in the Xinhua newspapers and the others. She was known as the Silk Road Lady, right? And so it is not surprising that in the last summit in Beijing, for the inauguration of the One Belt, One Road project, they invited Ms. Helga LaRouche to speak and address the body.
Yeah, we have some pictures of that, but I'm not sure we're ready with it right now, but that's one of the conferences. Now, this idea of building productive capacity of society is not, of course, new. No? And in Asia, as far back as the time of Rizal and Sun Yat-sen, this was already being discussed by Asian leaders. I think you've studied this. What do you recall that will help our audience understand this long dream and vision of building humanity through this infrastructure?
Well, even our Filipinos at that time understood very well that infrastructure was needed for development. And when you say infrastructure at that time, it needed, of course, it was water, production of food, bridges, roads, and rail systems. The development of the United States, even in the 1860s, during Abraham Lincoln's time, was actually railways.
The railways.
The railways. The Germany, before it got into the First World War, had an extensive railway system.
And then just prior to the Second World War, the Autobahn,
the
building
Autobahn,
of the expressways in Germany.
Connecting with different parts of, the Europe already had these things. So it was infrastructure for development. It is again not surprising that right after World War II, when these ideas were being promoted in a economic system initiated by great president of the United States, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as soon as he died, Harry Truman, who was controlled by the financial oligarchy, started to dismantle this whole idea. And eventually, especially in the Philippines, it got waylaid, this idea of infrastructure. And in its stead, a new system was promoted. It was called the floating exchange rate system, officially implemented somewhere in 1971. Floating exchange rate basically put money as a commodity, whereas prior to that, money was just a means to facilitate transactions, but not as a commodity. When you put it
So the term money markets probably developed after 71. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And people like Sixto Rojas and all of that initiated this money market system. We're taking advantage of that new system.
And they really, some of them really believe this is a great invention, this is a great new idea.
Yeah. And
But then what happened was money was being traded for money. And
when money became a commodity, right? It was easy to make money. Therefore, investments withdrew from the physical economy. The resources of the countries were pushed into speculation and away from investing in physical economy.
At some point in the recent history of General Motors, General Motors was making more money from its financial plays rather than manufacturing cars, only to wake up that the real economy transferred to China, and it is creating the real wealth.
Remember, China, they were preventing China from going into the World Trade
Organization,
participating in the World Trade Organization. And so it was pretty close. So rightly or wrongly, I mean, favorably or not favorably for China, it seems in the long run, it favored China because it concentrated its production, it brought up its skills of manufacturing, and because of its labor cost, the transfer of production went to China.
In fact, when you look at the Chinese propositions, AIIB, New Development Bank of the BRICS Alliance, and so on, the initial description of their programs were clearly for development. However, in seeking some compromise with IMF, World Bank, I'm afraid that there might be compromises that might not promote development.
No,
what do you think?
I doubt it very much. Of course, the IMF is going to try to. IMF participates there not really to. They know that the old system is dead, and they're seeing where the IMF could participate in this. But the next step after this AIIB and the BRI, or the Belt Road Initiative, the next step, I feel, is going to go into the Glass-Steagall type of concept.
But we have 1 minute left.
Okay, just very quickly.
We will have to have another session describing this.
But very quickly, since I opened up the idea of Glass-Steagall, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pushed this legislation called the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall, Congressman Glass, Senator Steagall, pushed a Republic Act in the United States, pushed a law that prevented banks from using depositors' money for speculation, right? Whereas that is what's happening right now. Now, when you prevent the depositors' money from going into speculation, meaning Wall Street, and force these banks to lend this to businesses so that the economy starts moving, so that you start generating jobs, then that is rechanneling resources to the physical economy away from speculation.
That's a fundamental concept, the physical economy versus the virtual economy. But we'll have to reserve that for another discussion. Thank you, Professor Butch Valdes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, this is this understanding of the financial battle is a work in progress for everyone. And so in the future, we'll have a continuation of this discussion. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a good understanding of the evolving One Belt, One Road and the physical infrastructure that humanity needs for pursuing further progress of civilization. Have a good weekend.